So Disenchantment Part 3 definitely laid more groundwork for ongoing mysteries than any season before it, and honestly, I'm here for it. Oh yeah, spoilers ahead for Disenchantment Part 3, obviously. There appears to be a ton of question marks surrounding Dreamland, including in regards to its rightful citizens and possibly its ruler. So with big mysteries comes rampant speculation, and I'm here to tell you why I think the show could be hinting that Miri the Mop Girl is Dreamland's true ruler. But intertwined with this whole idea are a ton of other great mysteries, theories, and speculation, and there's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Before we get to Miri the Mop Girl, let's talk about Elves, Trogs, and Dreamland. There was tons of new information revealed this season, but very few solid answers to those mysteries. But if we take a look at all of this information side by side, I think we can actually determine some likely answers, or at the very least, have some fun speculating. One of the biggest revelations at the end of Part 3 was this reveal.
The legendary ancient seat of elven power.
And the revelation that this legendary elven throne exists underneath Dreamland Castle. Now, we weren't told much more about it, but its mere existence implies that the elves actually have a history in Dreamland. An important history, given that this is a legendary ancient throne. But they also revealed some more evidence that could connect back to the elves. If you caught my video about decoding Disenchantment's ancient language, we translated this ancient script, which reads, "A battle was fought between these kings and the rightful citizens of Dreamland who lost and cast a curse on all future rulers." So if we take into account this ancient hidden elven throne, and the fact that the current citizens of Dreamland seemingly aren't its rightful citizens according to this script, then we can definitely speculate that the rightful citizens of Dreamland may in fact be the elves. And that's not the only evidence for this. The ancient throne of elven power bears this swirly symbol on it, and similar symbols can actually be seen throughout Dreamland and Dreamland Castle, almost as though the current society appropriated these ancient elven symbols as their own. But perhaps the most important piece of evidence that was right under our nose the entire time is the crown worn by the elven ruler, Rulo. Does this design look familiar? Well, it should. Take a look at it right next to Dreamland Castle. It was all right there from the beginning. This absolutely cannot be a coincidence. These designs are way too unique for that. I think when you take all of these things into account, it's impossible not to come to the conclusion that Dreamland was in fact an elven society. These elves fought with kings of Dreamland and lost, but then cast a curse on the future rulers of Dreamland. But here's where it gets even more interesting. That ancient script that we translated was actually scribbled on a torn page from a book called The Secret History of the Kings of Dreamland, which runs down all of the kings of Dreamland from Agog to Zog. This reveals that all of Dreamland's kings' names end with Og, but most interestingly, the pages are torn out beginning with what appears to be the name Trog. This also labels Trog as cursed from the little that we can read on the page. So I think we can further deduce that Trog may have been the king that defeated the elves, aka the rightful citizens of Dreamland, and was therefore the first to be cursed by them. But let's take this even further, because the name Trog has even bigger implications. We've also been introduced to a race of elf-like creatures that live underneath Dreamland called, you guessed it, Trogs. This cannot be just a coincidence. So here's my theory. After King Trog defeated the elves, they split. Half of the elves retreated to Elfwood to live in secrecy and hiding, a place we've seen extensively in parts 1 and 2, while the other half of the elves retreated underground and hiding underneath Dreamland. The elves that retreated underneath Dreamland evolved into what we now know as Trogs. It's possible that they named themselves after the ruler who defeated them, or that their obsession with this ruler ended up becoming their entire identity as a culture, but this information has now been lost to time. Trogs and elves obviously share a ton of similarities, but you can likely account for their pale skin tone as evolutionary after years of living underground away from sunlight. There are other interesting implications here too. It could mean that Trog blood has the same magical properties as elf blood, which also means it could have magical effects when used in the vial on the Eternity Pendant, which could come into play now that we've seen that this Eternity Pendant is actually amongst this junk that the Trogs stole from Dreamland Castle. Everything above, I am honestly pretty confident in. I feel like these theories really line up with the evidence thus far, but now is where we maybe get a little bit more speculative, but not without evidence. So let's talk about Miri the Mop Girl. Miri the Mop Girl has been a big mystery for the entirety of Disenchantment. A lot of people expected her to be of great importance in part 1 because of her prominent background presence. Then in part 2, we're properly introduced to her through her second job as a server slinging coffee.
You look really familiar, Miri. I have another job working for people who never notice me because they're so self-absorbed.
Now, admittedly, the main thing that set me down this hypothetical path was some of the imagery in part 3. These could of course be entirely coincidental, but I thought it would be fun to travel this path and see where it takes us. In episode 10 of part 3, it's revealed that Dreamland's crown doesn't fit on Bean's head, and she tosses it away. This honestly felt reminiscent of a bride at a wedding tossing a bouquet, and the person who caught it was none other than Miri the Mop Girl. But that wasn't the first image that made me think there might be something here. There's a blink and you'll miss it moment early in part 3, where a shot pans down through the various levels of Dreamland Castle. But if you pause, you can see Miri sitting ominously on the throne of Dreamland. This felt way too intentional, and the complete lack of attention drawn to it leads me to believe that there's something more to this shot. This show is absolutely rife with foreshadowing, so I have a theory here. If we're to go down this hypothetical path that Miri may actually be Dreamland's rightful ruler, we'd have to ask how from a practical perspective and why from a story perspective. We learned a lot about the line of Oggs in this part, including the fact that Una was formerly in love with Zog's brother King Yogg, who was poisoned. We get a brief glimpse of King Yogg in this portrait, and we see that he, as well as some of the previous Oggs, have much browner hair than Zog. Zog also at one point apologizes that he never went out with a human.
Sorry, I never went out with a human.
Which, that's a lot to unpack, including what it means for Bean and Dagmar, but I think this is an important pattern we've seen. Zog has 3 known lovers in the series: Dagmar, Una, and Ursula. The only known lover that we know of for Yogg is Una. So with the evidence presented, we can maybe deduce that the line of Oggs, historically, have a thing for non-human partners. Here's another fun little detail. Did y'all notice this cute little bear in part 3? Their hair sure is suspiciously shaped like King Zog's, isn't it? I think we can possibly assume that this is the child of Zog and Ursula after their affair. But if we take into account this attraction to non-humans, and the fact that Zog seems to have a habit of having children with all of these different fantasy species, and we apply that down the line of Oggs, it would not be ridiculous to assume that at some point, one of the Oggs mated with an elf. Given that they likely were Dreamland's rightful citizens, Dreamland must have been full of elves in the past. So here's where the rampant speculation kicks in. I think that it's possible that Miri is distantly related to one of the Ogg kings and an elf. Besides the throne room imagery, there are a few details / mysteries about Miri that lead me to believe this is possible. For one, Miri is short. We learn that she's 23 years old, and she claims that her growth was stunted due to drinking coffee, but I think this might be a purposeful misdirect. Obviously, if an elf mated with a human, their offspring would be small. We've even gotten evidence that Elfo is only half elf and possibly half ogre, and he is incredibly small. But if Miri is distantly related to an elf, it would make sense that each of her ancestors in that line would get a little taller until Miri, who is still short but not elf-sized. Secondly, we have never seen Miri's ears. Even when we saw more of her face when she's working as a waitress, her ears are covered entirely by her hair. I would not be surprised if a later reveal of her ears shows that they are pointy like elf ears. Speaking of her hair, and this part is flimsy at best, but still worth pointing out, Miri's hair seems to be the same brown as the historical King Oggs we've seen. And then there's of course the fact that we basically got confirmation that Miri is magical in some way.
Haven't you ever seen an enchanted broom before?
What are you, some kind of wizard?
Well, now that you mention it.
This could be explained by her being distantly related to elves, a magical race. Now, obviously this is definitely speculative based on imagery and history, and we don't have concrete evidence for this. But let's talk about why this makes sense within the story. It seems like Disenchantment may be setting up some of these characters who exist between multiple countries and societies that are at odds with one another as a means to eventually unite the world as we know it. It seems like Bean has a connection between Dreamland and Maru, Elfo seemingly has a connection between the elves and the ogres, and now possibly Dreamland as well if you take into account the elven history theories, and the show seems to be a little bit obsessed with uniting these different countries. If you're to assume that by the end of the show there will be a new rightful ruler of Dreamland, it would make the most sense if this person was actually related to both the line of Oggs as well as the elves. Though the script about the curse does refer to the rightful citizens of Dreamland, it doesn't imply that the kings are not the rightful rulers. From a story standpoint, I think it more than makes sense that Miri, a descendant of elves and Oggs, would be the best person to rule and unite Dreamland, potentially lifting the curse. So there it is, my theory on Dreamland's rightful ruler. Who knows if I'm on the money here, but honestly, after writing it out, I feel pretty confident that I'm on the right track. Honestly, I have never had this much fun speculating about a TV series, and it's what I absolutely love most about Disenchantment. We know for sure that we'll be getting at least 10 more episodes of Disenchantment, but though it isn't confirmed, a little digging around on the WGA website seems to imply that the show has been renewed for a third production cycle, which could mean that the show is slated to run at least 60 episodes total. This isn't confirmation, but it is a strong indication that this might be the case. I'm really eager to see how they decide to start tying up all these mysteries, but what do you think? Am I onto something with Miri the Mop Girl? If you have any theories about the Elves, Trogs, and Dreamland, let me know below in the comments. Make sure to do all the liking and subscribing stuff, and stay tuned. Peace.
Johnny to Cellos.